Glad to be doing this together, y'all. That's fun.
Take a seat if you have it. Go ahead and get started. Just a quick housekeeping announcement before we start. I'm told that the drink service will continue throughout, so if you still have your drinks ticket, the servers will be moving throughout the crowd as we proceed with the discussion, so feel free to continue with your orders. But I'd just like to welcome everyone to tonight's community conversation on love, suffering, and justice, the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. My name is Joel Harris, and it's been my privilege to partner with Coracle and the Trinity Forum in putting together this event. It was 50 years ago this month that an assassin's bullet pierced the cool evening air at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, striking down Dr. Martin Luther King as he stood on the balcony at the motel waiting to go to dinner with his colleagues. And tonight we'd like to use the anniversary of his death to reflect on the meaning of his life and his legacy, both for his times and for ours. And to introduce the distinguished panel of speakers to do that, please welcome Cherie Harder. Cherie is the president of Trinity Forum, and she will also serve as our moderator this evening. So please join me in welcoming Cherie.
Well, thank you, Joel, for that introduction, and welcome to all of you to our first community conversation on Martin Luther King's legacy, love, justice, and suffering. We at Trinity Forum are delighted to be partnering with Coracle and Corhaven in sponsoring this event. And want to send particular thanks now to all of our sponsors who have made tonight possible. Joel Harris, who you just heard from, Coracle, Rich Dean, Andy Biggers, John Langford, and the Falls Church Anglican, with a special thanks to Christine Buckholz. If you all could just wave your arms. So as you can tell, we have a very full house tonight. We actually sold out of space for this event several days ago. Apologies to your friends who weren't able to make it in. I know several dozen people are actually languishing on the waiting list. But if you have friends who are not able to make it in tonight, fear not. We are recording tonight's event. We'll be posting it on our website, www.ttf.org, as well as our YouTube channel. We'll be posting pictures on Facebook, live tweeting on Twitter, so let them know there are other ways to follow along and other ways to watch what happened tonight. If this is your first Trinity Forum event tonight, a particular welcome to you. If you have been to other Trinity Forum events, you may be realizing something feels a little bit different about this one. This is actually an inaugural event for us of a community conversation, which is a little bit different from our usual evening conversations in that we're attempting something a little bit more informal, a little bit more conversational, a little bit more directly engaged with the audience. We hope to have many other such community conversations, and are particularly grateful that you joined us for this, our first one. If you are new entirely to the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage in life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do that in part by hosting programs to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those great questions of life, and ultimately in coming to better know the author of the answers. And certainly, the great questions of life include, how to understand and embody love, particularly amidst enmity and hate, how to work for justice amidst extraordinary injustice, how to understand the potential for redemptive value in unjust suffering, and how to seek reconciliation and redemption amidst confusion and chaos. It is hard to imagine a life that better encompasses a heroic wrestling with such questions, and whose legacy offers more wisdom with our own grappling with questions of love, justice, and suffering than that of Martin Luther King Jr. As Jill mentioned, assassinated 50 years ago this month in Memphis when he was only 39 years old, Martin Luther King Jr. had achieved and suffered more in that brief time than most of us do in many lifetimes. A Baptist minister, he led the Montgomery bus boycott, served as the first president of the Southern Social Leadership Conference, organized the nonviolent 1963 protest in Birmingham, which resulted in his being tossed into jail where he pinned on scraps of paper and toilet paper his letter from Birmingham jail. He organized the March on Washington, where he delivered his I Have a Dream speech, and organized the Selma to Montgomery marches. His receipt of the Nobel Peace Prize and posthumous awards of the Presidential Medal of Freedom and a Congressional Gold Medal could well obscure or even whitewash the extraordinary opposition and hatred he faced during the 14 or so years in which he led the Civil Rights Movement. He was hunted, harassed, imprisoned, blackmailed, surveilled by J. Edgar Hoover himself, and even pressured by the FBI to commit suicide before he was ultimately murdered. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a paper saint, but a real man with faults and frailties who nonetheless consistently met hatred with love, faced injustice with resolve and courage, defended the oppressed and called out the complacent, particularly his white fellow ministers, whose inertia towards and comfort with injustice enabled it to continue. So what can we learn from his life, thought, and example? How did his ideas apply to our own differently yet deeply riven time? Tonight, while those are difficult questions to wrestle with and there are no easy answers, we have three panelists who are perhaps among the most equipped, prepared, and passionate of any to engage those questions. Cheryl Sanders is the senior pastor of the Third Street of God in D.C. and the professor of Christian ethics at Howard University School of Divinity. She has published more than 100 articles, sermons, and books, including Ministry at the Margins, Saints in Exile, The Holiness Pentecostal Experience in African American Religion and Culture, and Empowerment Ethics for a Liberated People. She holds a mathematics degree from Swarthmore College, her master's from Harvard Divinity School, and honorary doctorates from both Asbury University and Anderson University. She previously chaired the Washington, D.C. Mayor's Interfaith Council and served as the Vice Chair of General Assembly and the Ministries Council of the Church of God. Following her will be Bill Haley, who is the Executive Director of Coracle and the Associate Rector of the Falls Church Anglican in Falls Church, Virginia. After planting a church in Washington, D.C., Bill and his family moved down to the Shenandoah Valley to create a place of retreat called Corhaven. And there, to his surprise, ultimately became stewards of the cemetery for enslaved Americans. We'll let him tell more of that story. He has spent many years working for racial reconciliation and healing, most recently as one of the founders of the Repentance Project, which seeks to help recognize the legacy of racial injustice and help people respond meaningfully in the context of their own relationships. Finally, we'll hear from David Bailey. David is the founder and the executive director of Arabon, a ministry that equips Christians to engage in reconciliation. He's a speaker, consultant, and strategist for many national organizations in the area of culture making. He's also the co-author of Race, Class, and the Kingdom of God study series, the creative producer of the Urban Doxology Project, and serves as a teaching elder at East End Fellowship. He was also recently named by Christianity Today as one of the 20 most creative Christians we know. Each of our panelists will offer some brief thoughts on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and what his thought, work, and writings on the themes of love, justice, and suffering have to say to us today, after which we'll have a facilitated question, followed by questions from the audience. Cheryl, will you start us off?
I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to participate in this conversation, and I'm really excited to see a standing room only audience of people who are obviously motivated to be a part of this exchange of ideas and insights. So thank you for including me in this important conversation. I have indicated that I will try to keep my remarks focused on Martin Luther King's relationship and nurture in the black churches and also within the historically black institutions of higher learning. Sometimes his legacy gets skewed in peculiar kinds of ways. And he's such a unique individual, and he has been so heralded. It's almost like, and if there was a piece in the Washington Post today, there was a couple of book reviews reflecting on this. There's a problematic dimension of his legacy, and that is, as much as he is honored and esteemed and admired 50 years after his assassination, while he was alive, there was so much controversy. It's like everything he did was questioned. It wasn't just along the lines of race, but to be a leader under those circumstances is so complicated. And I think that on the one hand, we want to focus on what we can celebrate in his legacy, the principles, the ideals that we can cherish and embrace and run with. But I think it's to our peril that we maybe oversimplify what it required for him, what all went into that legacy. And so I know that's a problematic way to preface what I'm going to say, but I want you to hear my heart on this. He, as everyone knows anything about King knows, that he comes from a family. His father was a preacher, his grandfather was a preacher, his father-in-law was a preacher, his brother was a preacher. Came from a family of preachers in the southern African-American Baptist tradition. He did not grow up poor. He grew up in what we would call a middle-class environment. His family was intact, and his father and mother made every effort to shield him from the worst effects of living in a segregated society, but enable him to flourish in the neighborhood, in the church, in school, and in every endeavor of life that he showed interest in. And so he was somewhat precocious. He went to Morehouse College, which is a historically black institution, as a teenager, actually. And at Morehouse, he was exposed to black professors and preachers and a whole network of people with intellectual influence on him, and not to mention religious and spiritual. From there, he went to Crozier Seminary in Pennsylvania. At the time, it was located in Pennsylvania, and then to Boston University, where he did his PhD. And even the fact that he did a PhD in systematic theology sort of gets lost in the legacy. But he was a serious scholar of theology and religion. And so when he goes to Montgomery, Alabama, he's 26 years old. It's his first pastorate. He's still a graduate student. He's still writing his dissertation. but the opportunity arose for him to become a pastor, and he was very well sponsored and networked and recommended for the position. They didn't just say, oh, destiny has sent Martin Luther King. It's like, oh, well, we'll take a chance on him because he's so-and-so's nephew. It was more of a network kind of thing. And of course, what happened when he went to Montgomery, he sort of came up upon the bus boycott. That wasn't his idea. But he was willing to go with it. And he brought if you've ever read his book, Stride Toward Freedom, it's the first book that he wrote. He tells the story of how his sort of intellectual life, the life of the mind, prepared him to sort of stumble through the experience of becoming a civil rights leader. Let me just say also, at the time when he went to the Dexter Avenue Church, he was also being in a very significant relationship with people at Howard University, where I teach. And I just want to say that when he decided to go to Dexter Avenue, he also had been invited to become the dean of the School of Religion at Howard at a young age, at 26. Mordecai Johnson, who at the time was president at Howard University, was so impressed with him, asked him to become the dean of the school, and he turned him down. So Howard Thurman, Benjamin Mays, so many people had nurtured him and influenced him even in his 20s, but he turned down the opportunity to be at Howard. I wish I could say more, but I do want to at least establish that foundation of the black churches had an influence, the historically black institutions. And so when he engages in the larger conversation, which was it was global from the beginning. He didn't become global his last year. But his instincts and his intellectual input was formed and rooted in a significant black experience that prepared him to be a citizen of the world.
Well, my focus was particularly asked to be talk about issue of justice. I think it's over 50 years. A lot of times we can rewrite people's narratives, and I see this when it comes to King being rewritten in a few ways. One is seculars oftentimes don't want to respect and really honor the fact that King's action was coming out of theological motivations. There was a theological narrative that he was operating on, some presuppositions of which he was operating under. He also, a lot of times, conservatives oftentimes want to de-radicalize him. And I think everybody wants to have a holiday MLK.
Yeah.
I like what Dr. Cornell West says, is that we shouldn't deodorize MLK because he was funky. He was a blues man. He understood the sorrows. He understood the challenges that was going on in his day. And it's really important to understand, before he got assassinated, 70% of white folks didn't approve of what he was saying about the Vietnam War. And about 55% of black folks didn't. And there was actually a black denomination actually split over him because of the fact that he was considered too progressive, too radical. And so 50 years later, we all loved MLK, but everybody didn't love MLK while he was around. And I think that's a sign of, oftentimes a sign of true biblical leadership. Just to unpack a little bit about his understanding of justice and love, it's important to understand that he had a theological vision of a prayer that Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And what he was, in essence, saying, this vision of what he called the beloved community was a vision of people bringing their imago Dei, which is a theological term that means all people are image bearers, or people are reflecting the likeness of God, It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you come from. It doesn't matter even your intellectual abilities or lack thereof. Everybody's an image bearer, and we need to create a place on earth where that is flourishing. Now, I think when we hear the I Have a Dream speech, that's a foretaste of a vision of that that the brothers shared in Washington, and that's the part that we want to grasp onto. But when you look at the biblical narrative, yes, there's a vision of heaven, but there's also a reality of hell, and you can see hell on earth. And King also had a vision and a theological understanding of what some call in the scriptures empire. And part of what makes the good news of the kingdom of God good news is because there's a bad news called the empire that oppresses people. And so you begin to see, as Dr. King proclaimed, like, you know, I have a dream speech. When the time he got to the Riverside Church, and many people believe this is what got him his assassination ticket, was when he started to talk about, hey, this Vietnam War deal, this preoccupation with materialism in the United States, and we use militarism as a tool to maintain our materialism, and we use racial oppression. We use militarism overseas, we use racial oppression here on domestic land, and this is where he started to be a prophetic voice against the empire. And he began to say, hey, in essence, I'm wondering if this dream is really a nightmare. And this is the thing that many believe is what actually got him assassinated. So it's just important as we reflect on Dr. King, is to realize as long as you're talking about having a dream, and as long as you're willing to like get beat up on the bridge, people will celebrate you often. But then we become a prophetic voice and speaking truth to power and saying that, hey, Dr. King was always patriotic. He was kind of like the way my wife is to say, hey, I believe in you, David. But sometimes you act in certain ways where you're not being the best version of yourself. And I'm not going to let you be the worst version of yourself. And that's what Dr. King did for the United States of America, but that's also what got him martyred too.
Thanks, David. So great to be here. Cherie, in my introduction, mentioned that I was one of the founders of the Repentance Project, but the fact is, so is Cheryl and so is David. So this is like an opportunity for us to do something together, and that's a real blessing. It's a blessing to be together with you as well. Had I known what Cheryl was going to share and David was going to share, I probably wouldn't have prepared anything to say. So, but I will dive in. So reflecting on the legacy of Martin Luther King, I want to begin with something that is obvious and implicit, but all too often understated and perhaps left somewhat in the background. And Cheryl alluded to this, and that was that King was a Christian. For real. And actually. He was a believer in and a follower of Jesus Christ. He was a prayer before he was a preacher. He was a pastor before he was a civil rights leader. And it was his commitment to prayer that sustained his work for justice. It was his commitment to Jesus that sustained his strategy of nonviolence. It was his commitment to the kingdom of God that led him to work and hope for the beloved community on earth. Now, King was not perfect, but still it can be said, I think, that he actually embodied Christianity in his love and self-sacrifice and turning the other cheek. Perhaps more so than any other well-known American in the 20th century. I'll say that again and push it even farther. King actually incarnated actual Christianity more than most other Christians, even in the whole of American history. This would be his second greatest legacy, I think. His first greatest legacy would, of course, be the millions upon millions upon millions of lives both black and white, that are better situationally, morally, and spiritually because of his work and those he worked with. Second greatest legacy, as I mentioned, is his modeling of Christianity and modeling the actual words of Jesus himself to us and to the world. King's life shouts from a mountaintop, this is what Christianity looks like. And so I want to focus on two ways that that was true: consistent love and perseverance through suffering. First, consistent love. King was utterly consistent in his love for others and costly kindness, even and most especially demonstrated in how he handled his enemies. Demonstrated in both private conversation and then his public words, both written and spoken. It is remarkable. I'm not sure there are very many more words of King to be published, actually, that he didn't actually say. I mean, everything he had to say you can find in print now, it seems. And you just won't find him. You just don't find him. Even in private moments or moments of weakness, being unkind or contemptuous or mean. Even to those who would jail him, beat him, resist him, betray him, or would want to see him dead. Jesus said, love your enemies, and King did. I was just in Memphis to mark the 50th anniversary of his assassination, and again was able to take a deep dive into the dark viciousness of our country's history of individual and systemic racism and oppression and racial violence. And then I was in Montgomery this past week, most of you can figure out why, diving deep again, not only into our history, but our ongoing legacy of this awful thing of racism, and it's overwhelming. And yet, King knew that love was greater than evil. And that's what he did. And this comes out in many places, and was again struck recently in reading Strength to Love and his sermon in Love in Action, where he's writing about the Supreme Court justices who upheld the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Right? That upheld, it was the Dred Scott decision that upheld slavery in 1857. And of them he preached, the justices who rendered this decision were not wicked men. On the contrary, they were decent and dedicated men. But they were victims of spiritual and intellectual blindness. They knew not what they did. And he goes on into his own era about his own enemies. And then he says this, with Jesus on the cross, we must look lovingly at our oppressors and say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When I was in Memphis, I heard a Reverend Ralph West, who's the pastor of the huge Church Without Walls in Houston, a great student of King, said, King always saw the best in everybody, even when sometimes you wish that he would go low, but he wouldn't. He just wouldn't. He had his eyes on something greater than that. So consistent love is one of his great legacies. Secondly, perseverance through suffering. Beyond the challenges of simply being a black man in America during Jim Crow, the pressures on King from 55 to 68 were incalculable. It's hard to imagine. Even when we know some of the specific instances of threats that he was on the receiving end of. Just immense pressure. And as Cheryl mentioned, he was young. He was young, 26 when he was thrust into the national spotlight. And then he had 13 years of excruciatingly difficult leadership. King was a man familiar with suffering and well acquainted with grief for his whole adult life. And this led him to develop a deep theology of suffering, unearned suffering and redemptive suffering, which, by the way, ends up sounding quite a bit Catholic, actually. And I'm grateful that Micah Edmondson is bringing new light to this in his recent writing. And he writes, Dr. King would say that although suffering itself is not good, it presents an opportunity for redemptive engagement. The Lord has allowed suffering so that we might engage it in a way that bears witness to his redemptive hope and his redemptive purposes, not only in our lives, but even in the lives of our oppressors and in the systems and the institutions in which we live and exist. And the last 18 months of King's life were especially difficult. As one article puts it, the last 18 months before his assassination were fraught with danger, disillusionment, disappointment. He experienced challenges to his body, his mind, and his soul. And at one point he said that his dream, and David mentioned this, as in I have a dream, that his dream had turned into a nightmare. There's a recent documentary that HBO just put out this year that brings more light to the season than ever before, called King in the Wilderness. And in addition to confronting explicit racism in the South, he had taken up confronting implicit racism in the North. And encountering, in his words, hate in Illinois as great as any as I saw in Mississippi. And that's saying something. When his consistent, nonviolent ethic led him to speak out against Vietnam, well, David already shared with us the reaction to that. He lost friends. He began to doubt, began to doubt his strategy of nonviolence. Riots were breaking out in black neighborhoods, and it took a mighty toll. And in this, like Jesus, he persevered through it, incarnationally reminding us of the words of his own sermon from Transformed Nonconformist. That Christianity has always insisted that the cross we bear precedes the crown that we wear. To be Christian, one must take up his cross with all its difficulties and agonizing and tragedy-packed content and carry it until that very cross leaves its marks upon us and redeems us to that more excellent way, which only comes through suffering. I would call King's last 18 months King's long Gethsemane. He was modeling true Christianity for us at its deepest level. Jesus living in us and through us. Jesus reliving his life through his followers. Jesus displaying himself through our bodies, through our sacrifices, through our sufferings, even our deaths, as King himself would experience. And I think it would be right to summarize the life and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. as iconic.
I think that deserves. So as you can tell, there is a lot to chew on here. We only have about a half an hour to do it. So we'll be dedicating the last half hour to questions from the audience. So be thinking about your questions now, because obviously there is a lot of ground we won't have time to trod. But each of you mentioned love in some capacity, and that seems like a great place to start. One of the themes that Martin Luther King Jr. seemed to speak most about was love. Its creative power, its transformative power, that really only love had the power to transform an enemy into a friend. Only love had the power to really create a new order out of oppression. And I think several of you mentioned his views of brotherly love and the beloved community as well. Where did his view of brotherly love and the beloved community come from? Why did he focus so much on this? And finally, what was it about love that enabled him to persevere in showing love to his enemies, given the relentless and the brutal nature of the opposition? So that's a lot. Whoever wants to go first and tackle whichever one of those you'd like. It looks like you, David.
Something that's really influenced me over the last, when did Between the World and Me come out? 3 years ago? Yeah, by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I guess kind of known to the popular through a lot of his Atlantic articles. He brings out this point. Ta-Nehisi Coates is not a Christian. Matter of fact, he's a true atheist. He's not an agnostic that's upset with God. He really doesn't have anything to necessarily do with the existence of God. And it's important to understand that he got that way, not because of issues of epistemology, like how we know things. He's gotten that way because of ethics. A lot of times we like to quote King. It says, one quote says, the universe is bent towards justice. Ta-Nehisi Coates looks at our world and says, I don't see that to be true. And I would say that a lot of his description of and analysis of the problem in Between the World and Me, I think is very true. And I don't think that he actually doesn't have a solution. And I think that's because of his starting point. But something I want set the tone of what I'm about to say within that conversation is a point that he brings out in the book where he says, in school, folks like MLK and people that who protested against the oppression that they were experiencing through nonviolence are oftentimes given to us as heroes in our public education. But yet, folks like Paul Revere and George Washington are, when they kind of took their own agency and they fought against what they felt like was wrong oppression, they're considered the heroes. And the difference basically is one has white skin and another one has black skin. And then, you know, when you see a person like Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party, they are seen as, and they aren't heroes, they're villains. And because they took their agency and put, and said, hey, we want to exercise the same Second Amendment rights that as U.S. citizens as everybody else does, as white brothers and sisters get a chance to do that. And so I'm always, when we talk about love, like we oftentimes want to talk about love without that context of that's the way that we've been socialized. That when a person of black skin starts to operate the Second Amendment rights to fight against oppression, that's considered wrong. But then when folks of white skin do it, that's considered heroic. Now, clearly there's some contradiction in that. As a Christian, we know that Jesus said those who live by the sword die by the sword. And so Jesus was also born in a very violent context where folks would fight for their rights and they were ruled by the sword to oppress people. And Jesus was became a Messiah in that context with an oppressed people group. And I think it's important for us to understand that Jesus was even coming in that context. And Jesus, in the midst of that, spoke about love and yet empowerment. And the reason why he got assassinated and killed, not assassinated, but the reason why he got crucified was because, not because he was dying for our sins in a theological sense, but because he became a hero to an oppressed people group, and it was a threat against the Roman Empire. I think it's important for us to understand King's theology of love within that context, and not in this this other kind of narrative that we learn within our public education. And so, he asked the question, like, why was love so important? Because love is the only thing that can overcome darkness. But the thing is where the scripture says, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. King understood the depth of sin that was happening. And so he knew that he needed a deep spirituality, a transformation inward, his inward life, to have the kind of love that was needed to overcome this, principality of darkness that was going on. And so whenever, I'm in a conversation about this, I think it's always important for us to understand how evil and cruel our world is. How evil and cruel historically, like for hundreds of years, our country has been to Native brothers and sisters, black and brown brothers and sisters, and even currently our immigrant brothers and sisters, and those from Middle Eastern parts of the world. And it's in that space where Christian love has to go deep in some deep spirituality that says, hey, we're going to be like Jesus, even if that means that love takes us to our own version of a cross. And that is what Dr. King was operating under, that he realized that he is just only a pilgrim on this journey, and God has called him to a greater calling than a comfortable life here on earth.
Cheryl and Bill, anything to add?
Well, I would just add that on the question of why love dominated King's thought and discourse, just consider the alternative. I mean, this man grows up in the segregated South, and then when he takes a posture of resistance to racial oppression and segregation, I mean, his house is bombed and he's threatened and he gets these hateful phone calls and he's called all kinds of names. They put him in jail. All these things happen. So your choice is you can fight hate with hate or you can respond with love. And what he's trying to do is, and I just, let me just say, I brought with me a copy of the special issue of The Atlantic that's really good if you want to see some very insightful pieces on the King legacy, but also some of King's own writings are included in this special issue of The Atlantic. But I was rereading the letter from Birmingham jail. He's trying to appeal to Christians because Christians are the people who are hating him. And so he's trying to say, okay, wait, let's reset this. We are Christians. And so the language then is brotherhood. I mean, it's not inclusive, but this is 50 years ago. It's brotherhood. Brotherhood means that we all get along. Beloved community, everybody belongs. And so he's not appealing to atheists or Muslims. He's appealing to Christians. And so he's trying to say, okay, we're supposed to be the love club. And y'all are hating on us. So let's try to bring love back into the language because he's trying so desperately to establish the conversation. Okay? But he's establishing a conversation with people who despise him. And so let's keep that in view when we talk about love, because it's a radical love. It's not sentimentalism. It's not romanticized. There's a very radical, resistant, historian Larry Rivers did a piece about 3 years ago in the African American History Journal, Militant Reconciling Love. That's the name of the article, Militant Reconciling Love. It's militant. That sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But sometimes the love requires you to make a fist.
It's probably too simple to say, but I think one of the reasons why love was so central to King was, like I said, because he was actually a Christian and he read the Bible. I mean, it shouldn't be shocking, right? It shouldn't be shocking that love would be the heartbeat of any Christian's message at that extent. It's just that it's so rare that it becomes shocking when we actually see it lived out, which makes me think about my own Christianity and am I oriented around love as well. But I think for King, I just think he was a man of true faith. He was a man of true faith in God, true faith in the power of prayer, true faith in the teachings of Jesus, and a true commitment to nonviolence that stemmed from Jesus' example. You know, King is sometimes said to have learned nonviolence from Gandhi. He didn't learn nonviolence from Gandhi. He learned technique from Gandhi. But the principle he got from his Savior.
Can I respond to a thing?
Sure.
Bill and I got a chance to go to Israel together, and it was such a beautiful time getting a chance to learn about the brothers and sisters in that part of the world that has Israel-Palestine conflict. And as we got a chance to talk to Christians who were Israeli and Palestinian, as we talked to Muslims, as we talked to Jews, one of the things that I really got a chance to see as you have those three Abrahamic religions in that close quarters, everybody was supposed to love God. All three were supposed to love God. All three love their neighbor. Have different ways of understanding what that means, but all of them. Christianity was the only one that's supposed to love your enemies. And that was the thing that was like, wow. Like, it doesn't matter if I consider you my family, if I consider you my neighbor, or if I consider you my enemy. Like, that is very distinctly Christian in ways that I think we yet to fully understand.
So since time is running out, we're going to turn to suffering a bit. And in King's theology, what was the relationship between justice and suffering? And how and why did he see suffering in the face of injustice as having the potential for a greater realization of justice? Who wants to take that one? You're about to get nominated, Cheryl.
Suffering was not only a part of his discourse, but it was his trajectory. I mean, one of the things he was accused of was exposing people unnecessarily to suffering, the nonviolent movement, and there were a lot of young people who were involved, sometimes children. And I like to think that the radical edge of the civil rights movement 50, 60 years ago was always the students, the college students, the Jesse Jacksons were the radical edge. Even though, as young as he was, every time I see a video or a photo of King, he just seemed to be so much older than he really was because of his dress and his demeanor and his speech and the way he carried himself. But there's something about that youthful radicalism that was a factor there. But these people, even as a young radical, they're suffering. They're experiencing suffering, observing suffering, and responding to suffering. And the only way logically to respond to suffering is in the pursuit of justice. So one of the responses that I would have to Coates, and I actually have written a chapter in a forthcoming book of Christians responding to Between the World and Me, and so I'm looking forward to conversations with him from a Christian ethics perspective. But one of the things that he does champion, he doesn't have much to say about hope, right? But he champions struggle, okay? And my thing is, if you're going to champion struggle, you better think you have a chance to win. And the only way you have a chance to win is that maybe the arc of the universe, but you have to have some notion of justice, okay? And so with King, the justice is there, even if it's beyond, he says, I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. At least it's within reach. But if there's no justice, the suffering is pointless. And we cannot allow our suffering to be pointless. So we have to invent justice if it's not there.
Amen to that, preach. I think all roads lead to Bill Haley.
Yeah, but I'm not like one of the 20th.
Brother, Bill gave me the great honor. I don't know if you paid attention to his bio, where there's it was an unmarked slave cemetery on his property, and he built a memorial for these brothers and sisters, and he gave me the great honor to give words and reflections. And it's probably one of the most sobering things I've ever done in my life, to give. I mean, what do you say as an educated, free black man that I have made my living through my thoughts? And I remember one time I was holding my grandmother's hand. One time she said, "Baby, you never did any hard labor in your life, have you?" So soft hands, So, within that context, I realized how much of my faith is built on conditional faith, on circumstances that have things to do with my either intellectual abilities or my networks or whatever the case may be. And many of those brothers and sisters in that unmarked slave cemetery got introduced to Jesus through their oppressor, but somehow in the work of the Holy Spirit, they got a chance to understand the suffering Savior. And they had faith, and as they prayed, they weren't even praying for their deliverance. They were praying by faith for their children or their children's children's deliverance. And it was unimaginable that they just could even be free within that context. And so, I think there's something about like faith from the margins, where our Christianity is a faith from the margins, like suffering. I'm just in my own devotional life. I'm in Peter right now, and I'm just studying a lot of Peter, and holiness and suffering is all in the text. It's all in there, and I think the more options we have, whether it's educational, economic options, the illusion is that we can buffer ourselves from suffering. But suffering is really what forms us. It's what transforms us. It's the part of our, that's the faith, like taking up the cross and following Jesus is what it means to be a Christian, And, I think, Brother Coach, I was really grieved when I read that book, I was really, really grieved. I'm really glad that you're working on a response like that, because I just felt like whoever the brother has been engaging with just hasn't had a theology big enough to deal with the problems he describes, and even have an ethic, an embodied living that's even dealing with the level of troubles that he sees. And so we have a suffering faith, and even though we live in America, the faith that our historic faith is a suffering faith, and I think we need to learn how to get in touch with that some kind of way.
Amen.
Yes.
Can I push it farther? So, as I mentioned, I was just in Montgomery, Alabama, for the dedication of the National Peace and Justice Memorial, as well as the Legacy Museum, and these are both projects of the Equal Justice Initiative of Brian Stevenson. Y'all probably read about it in the news last week. It was devastating. It was shattering. I've been to a lot of places in our country that mark the racial injustices that our history is and that is our current situation, and I was shattered. I'll just say that. Without telling you too much about it, because I really do want to challenge you to go. And thankfully, DCA is introducing a nonstop to Montgomery like next month, which is amazing because it's very difficult to get there. So that's great. Now there's no excuse. Reagan to Montgomery. Boom. They had hologram images of the Legacy Museum is built in a warehouse that had warehouse slaves for decades and decades and decades. Not hard to find in Montgomery. There were more warehouses for slaves than there were churches in Montgomery, Alabama. 2/3 of the population of the town was enslaved. And so they had these hologram images of people who were behind bars, and these holograms were reading. They were actresses and actors, dressed in slave garb, reading the literal accounts of what they had written down and had been recorded in history. And then there's this one woman who was portraying in the real word of a real slave who had her children taken away from her at auction, which, by the way, happened to 50% of slaves in America. 50% of slaves were separated from their families in our country for centuries. So she was writing about how she wanted to see her children one more time. And she said, I just want to tell them one thing. I just want to tell them one thing. I just want to tell them God will take care of them. African American Christian faith typically is of another universe than white American Christian faith. And it is much, I think, closer to essential Christianity. And it is born from suffering. Right? The spirituals are actually full of hope for the kingdom of God because that's what they were actually hoping for. When's the last time we did that actually as whites? We don't think about it. They had to. And they believed it was coming. The power of prayer, the call to forgiveness, that there is a just God who will serve justice, that the next it's just all there in a deeply distilled sort of essence level Christian faith. It's almost like, I suppose, it's like pressing out grapes and getting wine or something. Something gets distilled into essence that I think, and so David, when we talk about a suffering faith, yeah, Christianity is actually a suffering faith. It's the anomaly of our experience of it as white Christians that makes it seem abnormal, except that it's actually normal. So.
Racial discrimination and injustice has been called America's original sin. Each of you have given a lot of thought to the life, work, and thought of Martin Luther King Jr. If he were alive today, what would he say about the divisions of our own time? Cheryl?
They would probably use a curse word in response to the civic discourse of our time. And I think that we are reaping the harvest of delaying this conversation by 50 years. And by that I mean, King used the nicest, loving language, suffering, justice, all this lovely language, theological, spiritual, biblical language to try to engage Christians on ethical issues 50 years ago, okay? And I don't know that we have advanced the conversation since then. And so I think he would be ticked off to know where we are today. That's what I think.
I think, man, I think King probably would be preaching more about materialism. And I think materialism is a Trojan horse that's pacified all of us, that has kind of numbed us to reality. And we have a crazy military force that keeps us away from just the messed up stuff that's going on in the world, and allows us to buy our clothes and our iPads and our food at a level that most people around the world can't even imagine. And what's happened over the last 50 years is that, fortunately, desegregation has been great for black individuals. It's been horrible for black communities. So here I am, one of the first generation of black people to be fully born with our rights. But there almost has been very little Christian discipleship and formation on how to steward this. Like, I think like King would be like, dude, if I was your age, with what you have in the community that you're a part of, man, I mean, there's so much that we could do. And I think the materialism has been the Trojan horse that has really gotten away and it's like numbed us from the kind of Christian imagination and the understanding of suffering and just the formation in many ways that, I mean, it's just some still real jacked up, messed up stuff, and I think even, I mean, when we talk like, even if it's like the new Jim Crow, I mean, I think that's a war on poor black and brown brothers and sisters, and that's a war that I really don't have to fight as much because I'm educated enough to kind of, and I've had certain circumstances in my life to be able to not to deal with that, but this is all of our problem, and the fight isn't over with, the war isn't over with, it's still going on. So I think those are some things that King would probably speak on.
John Lewis was at this event in Montgomery that I mentioned. He just kind of casually dropped the fact that he had been imprisoned. He had been in jail 45 times. And then he said, pregnant pause, and he said, 5 times after I was elected to Congress. And then pregnant pause, and he said, and I'm not so sure I'm done yet. And I think that if King were alive today, he would be figuring out creative ways of addressing systemic, racism, but also systemic injustice. I mean, we saw in the later part of his life, his theology, the implications of his theology it was broadening out, because that's what the theology of the kingdom does. It broadens out until so many things, anything that threatens the life of a human being becomes a concern because of the sacredness of the human being and because of the kingdom of God and encountering that. And so I think King would be creatively figuring out ways of addressing ongoing systemic injustices, because these things are not healed in our country. I think he would be concerned about mass incarceration. I think he would be concerned about gerrymandering and voter registration. These were things that they were concerned about 50 years ago. It's just these things take form or are changing forms. And so I think he would be nonviolently, creatively figuring out ways to draw attention and make for change. And he'd be very tired.
Can I just add one point to that? I'm thinking about the 50 years, okay? And had he lived, he would, it's not inconceivable, he'd be 89 years old. He could be in good health and sound mind, because there are people in that who are 89 who are able to, live their lives in a full kind of a way. I just don't believe that after 50 years he would still be protesting and still be marching and still be finding an issue. I think he'd be doing something different. And so my frustration is that many of us, our idea of protest is locked into 50 years ago. It's to have a march. Well, marches are wonderful. But there's some other things. And King, when he was alive, did those other things. The march just sets up, the protest sets up the dialogue. It sets up the coming to the table to make the decision. And so I just don't believe that if he had lived, that he would have spent the past 50 years marching. I just don't believe that.
Oh, well, can I add just to that? Because I think what you talk about is, I think we really underestimate the power of institutional building. And even the moment that King at 26 walked into was started by Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson and Elaine Locke, and these are folks that started the NAACP in 1906 or 9, somewhere around there. You're talking, by the time things manifested, there was a seed that was sown that took about 45 years to grow into something that King walked into. And so I just think a lot of times we overestimate what we can do in a march or in a year and underestimate what we can do in decades. And I think there's a lot, I don't know all of the folks that are in this room, but there are a lot of people who are influencers in institutions. And so, I don't think I've ever done a march, but you better believe that I'm really trying to influence institutions, and really having a long view. And, for me in my life, I'm 10 years into a 40-year plan that we've just been working into. So I just hope that's something that we pick up, because there's a lot that can be done when we think on an institutional level. And you might march a little less, but I'm okay if you're on the long game.
So we're going to turn to the most dynamic part of the evening conversation, which is where we hear from you, the audience. And those of you who have been to a Trinity Forum event before know that we have 3 guidelines to all questions. We ask that your questions be brief, especially tonight. I think there's going to be a lot of them. That all questions be civil, and of course that all questions be in the form of a question. So I know we have our fantastic volunteers ready to take the microphones around. Please wait till do a swap.
Please wait till the microphone gets to you right there, orange shirt, the other side.
Thank you to all of you, first and foremost, and kind of in the theme of all roads leading to Bill. You spoke of before glory. And it seems to me, kind of repeating what was said by you all, that over the 50 years since King's death, not a whole heck of a lot has changed, and that a big part of that is that the white church has not borne its cross. And so my question is, what's it gonna take for the white church to get motivated, hacked off, whatever, enough to pick up its cross and lead the generality of white America into racial justice?
Was that question directed at me? 'Cause,
I was just building on your theme, but it's to the family.
well, I mean, I do not want to take up all the time on this because I think actually this is, I'd love to hear y'all's response to this as well. What's it going to take? It's really depressing that what's happening right now in our country isn't already enough. I mean, so what's it going to take? Well, I mean, we gave this little card for the Repentance Project, right? And our hope is that we can help all Christians, but particularly white Christians, simply connect dots between slavery and modern day legacy, and try to apply a Christian perspective on those questions, to just simply recognize, to learn the history, and to be able to see what is the way that things are actually related to be able to, just for a simple example that I just saw, track the relationship between lynching and mass incarcerations, or lynching and life without parole, or lynching and the death penalty, and how these things are connected. And there's about 15 or 20 and probably more categories where you can see this operative. And once you start seeing it, it becomes overwhelming. But then it's like, gosh, I've got to do something. So that would be. I would just think, what's it going to take? First of all, is education, and I think also courage from the pulpit. To quote from Matt Chandler, who was at this conference in Memphis, white pulpits got to preach. And then he said, and I'm sorry to say that because some of you are going to lose your job over it. And he's right. And that's the cross. That is the cross.
Yeah, there's a serious malformation issue that's going on, spiritual formation issue. Presbyterian Church of America pastor friend of mine said it this way, white brother. He said it, evangelical Christians are capitalists first, American second, and then Christian. And we've been discipled into that, and so you got to be discipled out of that. And when we really understand this is a spiritual principality or it's a spiritual issue that's manifested economically, that's been legislated politically, and affects us relationally, when you understand that the spiritual, economic, and this policies have been put in place to keep that oppression happening, you know how to deal with it from a discipleship standpoint. And I just think, like I said, it's going to require those of us in ministry to equip the saints for the work of ministry, But I also think folks that aren't necessarily in vocational ministry, I also think it's going to require you all to be a prophetic voice to say, hey, I need some help to be a Christian. Because the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and so I think if you could be kind of manage up and lead up, I think that would be helpful also.
I wish I knew the answer to your question, but let me just say that on yesterday I preached from Ezekiel chapter 37 when the prophet the Spirit of the Lord took him into the valley of the dry bones. And there were 3 things that he was told to do: to prophesy to the dry bones. And that means that you survey the places where there's been trauma and death, and whether it's a museum or whether it's a living community, but to face the reality of the traumatized and then speak a prophetic word. And the second thing he's told to do is prophesy to the spirit or to the wind. And that to me means that somebody in the white church, the black church, whatever church, has to be engaging in a conversation with God. You know, it's good for us to have conversation with one another, but we need to include God in that conversation as a dynamic, directing voice and spirit. And then the third thing he does is to prophesy to the people, because there's no point in prophesying to the bones and prophesying to and carrying on a conversation with God if you don't also have a word for the people, being a word of hope, a resuscitating word. And so I just think that if the white church keeps going on the path they're on, it's going to die. I mean, everybody's going to leave. And so I believe that this is a CPR situation, and the black church is not far behind it. So we as Christians of different races need to come to faith, to challenge one another, to be in these kinds of conversations, but it's going to take a lot of faith to prophesy to those dry bones. That's what we must do.
Other questions? Mary.
Thank you all very much for what you've shared. And I love what you just said about talking to God about this. And I think as a culture, we've lost the ability, we don't even know what it is in large part of Western church to lament. We don't know what that spiritual practice is. We don't ever hear it talked about, practice, seen. How did Dr. King understand lament? And how did he live that out in his own spiritual formation?
Let's take that. Well, lament was embedded in his tradition. The music, the Negro spirituals are songs of lament. And the tradition, even the preaching, even the tuning and the intonation of the preacher is actually a moan. And so if you listen to the cadences of his voice, it's there. It's there. I'm not talking about the content of what he's saying, but it's just his rootedness in that lament. Much has been said about, especially, I don't really buy this thing that in the last few weeks or the last few months, because of his different discourse that set him on. Because I believe that he was addressing those issues all along. But there were periods of depression, especially toward the end. It seemed that he was profoundly depressed. And you can imagine, I mean, you're fighting this battle, you're struggling and fighting and being threatened, and the people that you trust, you can't depend on them, and you're doubting yourself. So he fought through a lot of these things, but always with this sort of foundational belief that God was going to work it out, without which you can't struggle. What I was saying earlier, if you don't think you can win, you can't struggle. Okay? And so I do believe that lament is something that we easily, lament's no fun. Okay? And some of us would rather have fun when we go to church than lament, so you just don't do it, because that turns people off. But there has to be somewhere in our foundations of spiritual formation. If you want to talk about spiritual formation, if you're doing spiritual formation without lament, I'm scared of you.
Anything else to add?
Yeah, I think part of what's happened to evangelical church growth strategy has been around what they call the homogeneous unit principle. So basically, the marketing, where we decided the homogeneous unit principle means that you find people that have a similar like, and you build a whole experience around that. So basically, what works to make a Chick-fil-A successful is the same thing that makes a megachurch successful. And so, and that's literally what's happened. I mean, there's studies on this. And so, you basically get preaching, music, and a children's ministry that focuses around the kind of white suburban family. And then you make sure that's the closest like a Jesus mall experience as possible. And you have, you're able to grow a church. As they grow older, you make sure you keep the older parishioners happy, and you have a safe church for a really long time. I'm saying that dry as I don't know what, but I mean, like, that's just literally what the church planting books are all about. And so that's the reason why you don't have lament going on in your church. And really what happens is, as a person that's pastored in that experience, I explain it this way: all humans bleed, but in the inner city, the blood's on the streets. In the suburban, wealthy spaces, it's a lot of internal bleeding. By the time you see the problem, it's the code red situation. And so this lament thing is not even just what's necessary for our public discourse, it's really what's necessary for people in the church. And if we didn't have a separation socioeconomically of our church worshiping experiences, then if you were like literally worshiping alongside homeless brothers and sisters, poor brothers and sisters, with rich brothers and sisters, you would have to lament, because you'll be confronted with things that your money can't fix, and your money can't hide, and your money can't sweep away. And so I really, really think the socioeconomic diversity of who we worship with is essential for us to do these things, because we're not smart enough to figure this out. The way that God wants us to do is to figure this out in a relationship with one another, and allowing that to form us. And we are forced to lament in that, and always invite God into that space.
We'll take one more question. Nate.
My question kind of follows on what Dr. Cheryl, what you said about Martin being pissed off today, and then also maybe a little bit about how he would be pissed off today, and then a little bit about how he the love that requires the fist. And this past weekend we lost one of the greatest giants in the theological world with the death of Dr. James Cone. And one of his greatest legacies is reading Martin alongside Malcolm X. And so I was just curious if you guys had any thoughts about whether when Martin died he still had anything to learn from Malcolm that maybe could still teach us something today. Then also, if there's anywhere where that sort of, that unity would have stopped. So.
Well, some years ago, I did a book, Empowerment Ethics for Liberated People. I think was in the 96, something like that. And I have a chapter in that book where I compare Malcolm with Martin X, but Malcolm X with Martin Luther King. But my reading of those two men is very different from Dr. Cone's. And I was stunned to hear of his passing over the weekend, because Dr. Cone, James Cone, wrote the seminal text in Black theology in 1969, so it's almost 50 years ago, Black Theology and Black Power. And what he was doing was bringing a politically radical edge or response to the nonviolent approach of Martin Luther King, but with a nod to Malcolm. Because even though Malcolm X was not, I don't see him as a purveyor of violence, but he was not nonviolent. And so Cone was wanting to take Malcolm's edginess and bring it to Martin's Christianity. And so the Black theology discourse has been very dominant in theological education for the past 50 years, and there will be a lot more to say about Dr. Cone's legacy. But one of the things that one thing point out about Malcolm and Martin, they did have a relationship. They had a relationship. And one thing that Malcolm did was he was always a man who was ready for the next transformation. Spiritual transformation is very much more a part of his life than Martin. Martin, you don't see spiritual transformation, you see more of an unfolding of the logic of the spirituality of his origins, but you don't see him changing. Whereas Malcolm changes his name twice because of his spiritual transformation. So what I would want to see is Christians who are radicalized in that transformative way. I would want to take Malcolm's radical approach to spirituality and bring it into Martin's focus on justice.
Anything to add?
No, I mean.
Colleen, come and help close us out.
Absolutely. I don't know how you move on from that. Thank you so, so much. Without saying, we would really like to be able to do more of this. And so I am the development director of the Trinity Forum. My name is Colleen Horrocks, and I'm here to invite each of you to join us at the Trinity Forum Society. Trinity Forum Society members are the ones who make this possible. In addition to our valued sponsors for this evening, you each have a brochure somewhere near you on your chairs. And if you would be able to join us, we would love that. So much of what we do from day to day is driven by your faithful commitment to financially support this work, those of you who are members. It includes not only creating events like what we've shared tonight, but also includes publishing our quarterly classic works, which you may have seen over here on the book table. I'm holding here a letter from Birmingham Jail from Dr. King. And those quarterly classic works draw attention to the best of Christian thought from both yesterday and today, and are specifically designed to help us think more deeply about some of these discussions, but also more deeply about our Orthodox Christian faith. For those of you who are not currently society members as of yet, we know that you're probably thinking about it right now. You should know that all supporting members receive not only discounted registrations to future events, but you will also receive a new Trinity Forum reading each quarter. We put them out each quarter, delivered right to your very own home or office, and they make really great gifts, too. We also send out a daily email with curated articles from current publications on topics surrounding those big questions of life within the context of faith. If you're interested, and I can see that some of you probably are, then you'll not be surprised to learn that you can join us tonight. There are brochures on your chair, and also if you'd like to talk with Alyssa Abraham, Ashley White, if we could raise our hands, Ashley White, too, thank you. Come talk to any of us. And as a special gift this evening, if you do sign up with us, you will receive a brand new copy, your very own letter from Birmingham Jail, which will be very helpful because I'm also about to announce that we are going to continue this discussion with a Trinity Forum reading group on Letter from Birmingham Jail on March 23rd. Thanks guys, it starts with an M. On May 23rd in our Trinity Forum conference room over in Northwest DC. We're right off of Vermont. So we'd love to have you join us for that, and you'll see the invitation come out in email in a couple of days, but you guys are the first ones to find out about it. And we have a sign-up sheet over here on the book table too if you're interested. It's only going to be open to about 30 people, so get in there quick. All right, well thank you so much for joining us here tonight, and Sheree?
As we wrap up, it's always appropriate to end with thanks. So let's give a round of applause for our panelists. Well, who helped make tonight possible. We really appreciate being able to partner with Oracle and Bill. I want to give special thanks to Joel Harris, one of our sponsors, who was really deeply instrumental, really the chief germinator of this idea, the catalyst to make it happen. So Joel, we're grateful for that. As well as the other sponsors here whose generosity helped make this possible, including not only Joel and Oracle, but Rich Dean, Andy Biggers, John Langford, and the Falls Church Anglican, with special thanks to Christine Vokoltz. I'd also just like to thank the volunteers who have helped make tonight happen. Hannah Wolf, Lexi Marone, our fantastic interns, Caleb Luke and Nathaniel Shuk. Photography, we had an assist from Play & Company. AV Actions did our videography. And of course, a great thanks and shout out to my terrific colleagues, Colleen O'Malley Horrocks, Ashley White Brothers, and Alyssa Abraham, who do so much behind the scenes to make this all possible. Finally, thank you to each of you for joining us tonight, and good night.
Well, this was great. I hope this was good for you guys.
It's
an awesome
fantastic.
venue.
Are you kidding? Yeah. I mean, it could be bigger, obviously.
Yeah, I know. That'd be awesome. Yeah.
It really would be.
You know my wife, Kate.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
so
So this is the first time we've met.
That's what I'm
but-
saying.